A social science perspective helps us to acknowledge the unique devastation when abuse is committed within the church. Much of the thinking around abuse in the literature comes from abusive therapists or doctors in one-on-one settings. When abuse occurs in the context of the churches, it's profoundly and uniquely devastating for a number of reasons. And I want to just point out three. First, abuse that occurs within the church occurs within the context of faith and trust in God, scripture, and sacred tradition. As such, it exploits, defiles, twists that holy space. Its corrosive effect can't be overstated. Second, abuse that occurs within the church occurs within the context of a community that we often liken to a family. More than just a mere social group, it's a place of vulnerability, care, and acceptance. The communal ouster of abuse victims, which is by far the most typical result, is often more devastating than the initial abuse itself. And then third, abuse that occurs in the church occurs within the context of an institutional structure that bears a remarkable similarity to other structures, namely in its propensity to preserve itself by insulating itself from transformative change and absorbing potential threats through resistance, satisficing behavior, and the preservation of the status quo. I believe that a social science perspective that considers research on complex organizations, group dynamics, and social movements has a lot to offer here. Such research helps us to see how organizations often work to bureaucratize, scapegoat, and preserve the status quo. As a case in point, as some of you know, there are currently a handful of states that maybe many of you or all of you know that outlaw relationships, sexual relationships between church leaders and members. I think it's at 13. One of the reasons that it's not more than 13 is that church lobbies in many states have actually worked to quash the legislation that would hold the church accountable. I think at the best, social science, especially the critical theorists, frame perspectives that remind us to critique our structures, to reflect on the motives and actions of ourselves and others, and to imaginatively reflect on the context within which we find ourselves. The bystander effect, many of you may know of, helps us to identify and understand the tendency in churches to abandon and neglect survivors. Studies on individuals' a tendency to obey authority, the Milgram study, for instance, it's an interesting study that you can Google if you haven't heard of it. It's the obedience to authority, which tests how far people will go to follow the orders of those in authority, and it's to frightening ends. Studies on the human tendency to conflate charisma and giftedness with character and integrity show us the destructive potential of an influential individual, let alone such an individual propped up by an institutional power structure.